Hi, everybody. Matt Yonkovit here. I'm here to talk to you about the business of open source. Thank you for attending my Fosdem 2022 talk. I hope you enjoy it. Now, who am I? That's a good question. I'm Matt Yonkovit. I'm the head of open source strategy at Percona. I've been with Percona for over 12 years, and I have almost 20 years in the open source space. Head of open source strategy at Percona is in charge of all of our open source community activities, our strategy around open source, and working across the community. We're here to help people with open source databases and all of their different database needs. Check us out if you don't know about us. You can reach me at Twitter at myonkovit, or you can drop me a line, follow me on LinkedIn or other locations. I also host a podcast. So if you're interested in open source discussions and all things happening in the open source space, go ahead and check out the Hoss Talks Foss on your favorite podcast app. Now, me personally, I wanted to talk a little bit about nostalgia. You see, I grew up as a child of the 80s, and I was a child of that Saturday morning cartoon generation. And I loved the Transformers. Transformers were my jam, right? It was something that I was very, very passionate about as a child. It was something that I wanted to collect as many of the toys as I could. I was very fond of all things Transformers related. And this dominated the early years of my life. And imagine Christmas in the 80s. You've been watching these shows for all this time. You find that you want the newest, greatest toy. You put your toy list together from the wish list. You ask all of your relatives to bring you, that awesome thing that you want, that you've seen on television for all these years. And when they bring it to you, you eagerly unwrap the present, only to find you got a GoBot instead of a Transformer. Now, if you're not familiar with the difference, there is a fairly drastic difference between Transformers and GoBots. They are not the same thing. All right. Now, you could see on the right, the Transformer, it's got weapons, it's got, different pieces that move in arms, and the GoBots are very kind of stiff. They only have like 2 or 3 positions that you can do. They're not the same thing. Okay. And this is very similar to what we see in other spaces, because here's the thing. Success means someone will copy it. And the success of the Transformers, obviously people want to capitalize on that. And, the success of other toy lines or other things means that someone will copy it, because they say imitation is the highest form of flattery. But of course, according to this meme, it's just annoying. But it's not just about that, right? I mean, you look at success in the imitators that are out there. People are often doing this across multiple industries, whether it's toys or not. Famously, Star Wars. I'm a big Star Wars fan. I'm a nerd when it comes to all things sci-fi or cartoony. So, bear with me on some of these. But when you look at some imitators, oftentimes they're not up to snuff. So the famous quote unquote Turkish Star Wars, where they actually took footage from Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, and they made a movie in Turkey about it, was vastly different than the original. And in fact, if you haven't seen this, I would recommend it, because it is so over the top crazy. It is a cult classic. However, it is nowhere near up to snuff the original Star Wars. But it's not just imitators that you have to watch out for. Oftentimes, the creators and the maintainers of these things often do things that go a little too far. And sometimes they introduce new characters or new things that alienate the community. And we've seen all of this in the open source space as well, because guess what? Everyone loves a winner, and open source is a winner, right? Let's be honest. You can't turn around without seeing another open source company or an open source IPO or, all of the power that is out there in the open source space. Any new project or application that's starting out is often looking at open source as the format that they start with. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing. Okay. And let me talk to you a little bit about that. And so this is where we start to see investors coming in and they're looking at what has transpired in the open source space, that success. And they're saying, how can I copy that? Right? I want to be the next MySQL. I want to be the next MongoDB. I want to be the next fill in the blank. And I have talked with people who have legitimately been told just that. You need to look at this other open source company. Look at MongoDB and how they did it. And these are companies that aren't even in the database space. Oftentimes people look and they lump all open source software in with other open source software. You should look at how they did it and you should just copy it. Go try and hire people from that company because they know how to do it. They were successful. And the investors start by looking at these open source companies that have been successful. And they start with the project itself. You look at the project and you say, whoa, the investor goes, wow, look at how many users they have. Look at how many downloads. Look at how many people are using their software. It's a ton. And so they get really excited about that adoption because they see when, you've got 20 million downloads, 100 million downloads, you've got regular users, you've got people who are using your software and the community is active and vibrant. They're saying, I think I can monetize that. I think that I can take my dollar and turn it into 10 or my $1 billion and turn it into $1 trillion. And so they get money dollars, money bags in their eyes, and they get really excited. But there's kind of a problem with that. Okay. The math doesn't always work out the way that you would think, because oftentimes you start with, this, wow, look at this adoption, but not all open source software that has a lot of adoption is a profitable company or provides something that people actually want to pay for. And a lot of the developers who use and love open source treat open source as Legos, right? You're going to take the best components and you're going to fit them together and to make something awesome. Who doesn't love to build something cool and awesome? And because of that, the pieces are often interchangeable. So you might have one project that uses library A, and you might have another project that doesn't because it doesn't fit, or you might want to try something new. And that's something that as a community, as a group of users, I don't know about you, but I like variety. I get bored easily. And I think a lot of other developers are like that. They like to try new things. How many of you would be comfortable just sticking with the same stack for 10 years? Maybe some of you would, but I'm guessing there's a lot who aren't because there's new innovations, there's new exciting things. I've seen this over my time in my career where I've worked with some really smart people who I thought, man, that guy's really good at doing this. They're a great PHP developer. They're a great, MySQL DBA. They're great at this. And you know what? After a few years, I'm kind of over that. I want to do something else. I want to extend my wings. I want to try something new. And even those who stay in the space, they're often looking at new technologies that can make things easier. And so those Lego blocks tend to change quite frequently. And those new ideas that are starting to pop up get people excited and they want to try them. And in the database space, this is very classic. There's 1,000 different databases out there right now, and you can try a database for almost any purpose. And so it's not just about picking the same old database you used 10 years ago. It's oftentimes, let's try this new thing. Let's try this new idea. Let's use this new project. And new things tend to get us excited. They invigorate us. They make us want to do more. But this is not something that is compatible with someone who's trying to build a long-term business in a lot of cases. That constant churn and turnover means that you could have something that really works really well today, and if it doesn't get established, tomorrow it's replaced by something else, or somebody else tries something different. And so it's really hard for a lot of investors and a lot of companies to make go of that. Now, vendors, investors, and companies needed a new approach. They need to think outside the box because here's the thing. If you're willing to pay for something, you have to continue to be willing to pay for it. And if you're looking at, a lot of the individual components as Lego pieces that come in and out, what you'll find is that, that it's very transient. It's very transportable. You can move things around, and that doesn't really generate a lot of, reoccurring business for companies. And so that's why you've seen the success of a lot of open source companies in a very narrow space in the open source world. And investors kind of figured out, and those who are in the know, that he who controls the spice controls the universe. Now, I'm sure that you have heard that before, but if you haven't, let me explain it in a very Lego-like way. If you've ever played with Legos and you know anything about Legos, the base plate for Legos is probably one of the most important things you can have. It ties all of your Legos together. And they never give you enough inside the Lego box to make it meaningful. And when you buy the big boxes of just a dozen or hundreds of bricks, oftentimes you don't get enough of these. And so, from a company perspective, from an investor perspective, people say, if open source is so transient, if it's, people are constantly changing out, some of those Lego pieces, what if we made the base plate? What if we made the thing that everyone builds upon? And that's why you see so many infrastructure companies as those that are being the most successful or viewed as the most successful open source companies in the world. And so it's about building the infrastructure and then letting everyone else have their Lego pieces to put on top. And if you change those Lego pieces, you're still using that same base infrastructure. And so those building blocks are really around that infrastructure, right? Databases, containers, operating systems, whether it's database as a service, infrastructure as a service. This is where you're seeing the battleground today in terms of the open source and the technology space as a whole. Everyone wants to control the spice. They want to control the flow of traffic. They want to control the foundation that everyone else is using. And that's where we find ourselves. Now, with that, there are a few common open source business models that I want to touch on and cover on before we dig in any deeper. Okay, so 4 real main business lines. You can argue that there's a few others, and we can go into those in some other time. But let's go through the most popular open source business models that are out there. The first one is a services only model. Okay, this is where companies make their money. They make their revenue off of delivering either professional services, consulting, support, managed services, some other thing. You give away all your software for free, and you then let them come to you and you help them when they need help. Okay. This is classically a very low margin business. And when I talk about margins, what I mean is how much money you spend compared to how much money you make. If you think about a services model, it is very resource heavy in terms of people, right? You are delivering a person or a individual relationship. That individual needs to get paid. They need benefits. They need everything else that they're associated with. So it tends to be a very low margin business. It's not very attractive from an investor community perspective because you don't make much money. Maybe you make 10%, maybe you make 20% if you're really lucky, but it's very low margin compared to software companies. And you're really reliant on users finding value in what you're delivering, the services. Because if it's free, the software, and they can go out and get help on Stack Overflow or in forums or somewhere else, they're probably going to go there first, and then they're only going to come to you. And if they do come to you, if you don't show them value, then you know what? Yeah, they're not going to stick around. You have to continually prove your value. and make sure that you're, showing your best. So it works, and you can make a successful business, but the definition of success based on what investors see might be vastly different. So this is a model. It is a difficult model for sure, but it is a classic open source model. Now, probably the most successful in terms of like the history of open source has been that open core, which is where features are reserved for paying only customers, right? And so this is where you see like an original MySQL, or when Mongo originally came out. Most of the database companies started off following this open core model. And what open core does is you'll have your open source version, and then you'll do a souped up version with all kinds of features and exclusives for only your paying customer base. Now, this has some decent value. It can create some stickiness, but it is very prone to disruption because you have this open source version that has, let's say, 80% of the features. The other 20%, someone can come along and replace. They can create their own open source version. They can fork you. They can, put out patches that, enable those enterprise features. And we've seen this over the years. So this is also about trying to generate some stickiness and to generate some ability for people to come in and see value in the software and in maintaining a relationship with you. And it's really important for businesses to show that value. And if they don't, then obviously people go away. And there's generally a higher level of retention when it comes to open core software because there is some value there. But over time, especially if those features are more niche-y, people tend to look at the community versions as a viable alternative to save on costs. And so open core, while it is still prevalent, has really fallen out of the standard model or the standard mode for most people starting an open source business. It does exist. It's just not as popular. Now, right now, the most popular of the open source business models that are out there is the as a service. Now, you can argue that this isn't even really an open source model at all. But the idea is here is some sort of software that's out there. Now, you don't want to run this on your own. Maybe you can't run it on your own. Come to us and we'll run it for you. And that's where you see whether it's database as a service in the form of like an RDS or an Azure SQL, or Kubernetes, as a service, AKS, EKS, Tanzu, fill in the blank. You're taking open source software, you're enhancing it, and then you're running it as a service, and you're allowing people to build on top of it. And this is the Lego base plate approach, right? So you provide that low level infrastructure, and guess what? Take on all that other open source stuff that you want and build it on top. And there's a lot of value to customers because they're looking at this as a way that they don't have to manage that infrastructure or understand it. They can focus on development or coding. And there's a high level of stickiness, or dare I say lock-in a lot of cases here, because once you move into an as a service, once you're trusting someone to manage an infrastructure, you're kind of trusting they do the right thing for you. Doesn't always work that way. And there are a lot of benefits, but there are some drawbacks. But this is where most companies entering that open source space, or have been in the open source space, are moving to. There's been a lot of companies that have completely ditched open core and said, you can have our, whole thing for free, provided you don't run it as a database as a service or as a service infrastructure. And then you come to us for the as a service. So a lot of people have gone all in on the as a service. And that's not just in the database space or in the open source space. You're seeing that across the industry. When you look at like Office 360 for Microsoft, or you look at the Adobe suite, it's all about subscriptions and reoccurring value. And so how do you build that up? And this is where there's quite a bit of stuff going on. Now, the last model that is kind of a hybrid, and this is where you're starting to see this, how do we mix in everything together? And this is where you've got like tooling that you provide, and you've got maybe some open core software, and maybe you've got some database as a service, but you're trying to merge these all into some seamless subscription. A lot of people like to go back to the Red Hat model and say like, oh, it's a subscription. A lot of times it's services with a little bit of software, a little bit of something else. But this is where I think that you'll see a lot more developed, where you've got, maybe some narrow band open source software with tooling around it, and the tooling is in the as a service space, and the narrow band open source software, maybe it's a couple components. Someone will run it for you, but they'll provide you all kinds of tools to really enrich it. Okay, and that's something that I think is starting to see some traction. Now, of those four businesses, I mentioned that kind of the new wave, the new place people are focusing on is the as a service. But let's look at the open source industry as a whole and some of the things that have happened in the last year or so. When we look back at 2021, we see that there's been quite a few big IPOs and some big merger acquisition type news. And let's talk about each one of these. Okay. Because, just because these were big and they had some big outcomes doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing either. And let's talk about that great disturbance in the force, if you will. So Couchbase had an IPO. And again, infrastructure company. And certainly there are others outside the infrastructure company, but let's look at this. They do database as a service, and they're very focused on database as a service nowadays, but they also do open core, valued at about $1 billion, and have about 103 million in revenue. Now, that 103 million comes at a negative 33 million loss in terms of profitability or income, net income. Confluent, your favorite Apache Kafka provider, also does database as a service, open core, valued at $4.5 billion. Very successful IPO on $208 million in revenue. And they have lost $229 million in terms of to get that $208 million. So they're actually spending over $400 million to get $200 million. GitLab, very famous, successful unicorn, valued at over $15 billion, providing that infrastructure for your source code. 152 million in revenue, and they lost 213 million. Are you seeing a pattern here? HashiCorp, which people claim was depends on who you talk to, could be more successful than GitLab, as successful, could be a little less, but they're kind of neck and neck for that, who was the darling of last year. And, $14 billion. Good job. 211 million in revenue, and they lost 83 million. So you can see this pattern. Okay. There's one more, and Cloudera here is an interesting case because they went IPO in 2017 and they got reacquired, okay, by a PE firm. So they went unpublic, they went private. What makes this an interesting case study is you can see that they were valued quite largely, $4.1 billion. They merged with Hortonworks for $5.2 billion. Then they got sold for $4.7 billion. So despite all of their gains over a period of several years, they were still kind of just valued at the same level, and they didn't really grow that much. In fact, they shrunk a little bit from when they merged with Hortonworks. They continued to lose money as well. Now, depending on how you value these companies and what you're looking for, you can see these IPOs and the outcomes as either the best or the worst. Here's two articles written around the same time about, like one says the top, one of the top IPOs, the other one says, ooh, this could be the worst one. And the reason for that is people value different things and they value them differently. And you look at, from an open source company perspective and where the dollars are, and this chart might be a little hard to read, but let me give you the keep it short version of it. There's a lot of revenue here. There's a lot of money being thrown around. In order to get that money, all of these companies are spending more than they're bringing in. They're relying on investor dollars with the thought process that if we invest in future revenue, if we invest in future growth, eventually we'll be able to make money. Now, I call this the eventual profitability model, which is fitting for database companies who follow the eventual consistency model. But I think you get my point. Now, I do blame someone for this. I blame Amazon. Of course, in the open source space, we all have to blame Amazon for something, right? I think that's like part of our, credo. Actually, more specifically, I blame Jeff Bezos, but not for what you think I might be blaming him for. This is not about cloud disruption. This isn't about AWS, pilfering source code or open source. Amazon fundamentally changed how people look. And remember what I said, that success brings imitators. Okay? This isn't about open source in this case. This is about emulating the trajectory of Amazon. How did Amazon become Amazon and dominate, the world? If there's any company that is, probably up there, it's Amazon, right? I mean, in terms of their breadth right now. The fact is, it is acceptable from an investment community for companies to see revenue growth, but not have to show any sort of profitability or ability to turn a profit. And it is a hyper growth, do everything you can, spend money, burn bridges, do everything to grow your revenue and grow your customer base, right? This is not a cloud specific thing. This is about money, control, exit plans, right? How do we take what we have here? How do I invest, $1 and get $100 at the end? And the willingness to burn the open source community and to, do things that, might be a little bit out there is more acceptable if it leads to that positive outcome. Now, I mentioned my blame for Amazon and Jeff Bezos specifically, and here's where it comes from. Jeff Bezos famously said, profits are bad, because he got a ton of grief on Amazon doesn't turn a profit. What the hell? Why aren't you turning a profit? You have to turn a profit. It took them 14 years to become a profitable company. And his thing was, you know what? Eventually, we'll be able to print our own money. And he was kind of right. But for every Amazon-sized company, a million other companies fail. But everyone's copying that. And it's, it doesn't matter. We'll just throw money at it and eventually it will work out. And this is the mentality that we're entering from an open source perspective. This is where, we take the open source companies and the investment dollars that are coming in to help us grow this community, and we're now in this hyper growth, gain revenue, gain customers, keep customers at all costs mentality, because that's how Amazon did it. And so how do we emulate them, apply it to the open source community, and apply it to the growth and the adoption rates that open source had? But here's the thing. Getting a profitable open source business is freaking hard. Right? It's hard. And there are a lot of challenges that go with an open source company. A lot of companies don't want to pay for open source right off the bat. It's free. Why am I going to pay for something that's inherently free? Okay. Those that do pay, they're paying because they want, the insurance or the support, aspects of that. So in case a bug happens, in case there's a security breach, someone will fix it, which is cool until someone at that company changes. Management changes over, someone doesn't value that insurance anymore. Then all of a sudden, oh, you know what? We can flip it out. We can go to a lower cost insurance. We're never going to use it because, let's be honest, insurance is probably the only thing people pay for and they never want to use. When you talk about, services, which a lot of companies still base, especially smaller companies, a lot of the revenue off of those services, very low retention rates, very hard to keep people in. In order to grow businesses, you need subscriptions, you need renewals, you need the expansions, right? That's how you grow the businesses. Is you start off and you say, I'm going to sell to 100 customers. And then next year, I'm going to keep 100 customers and I'm going to add another 100. Then I got 200 at year 2. So you can't lose them because otherwise you're just continually filling them up. And a lot of these technology companies that we're talking about, the infrastructure side, they're uncool, right? I mean, databases, I love databases. Databases are my jam, but they're uncool, right? Like nobody wants to think about them. And so you have all of these things working against, a successful open source company. And let's be honest, not everyone measures success the same way. And this is where I think as we go to the next generation of companies that are in this open source space, when we look at what that success looks like, if we're measuring based on success of today, it's all about customer growth. It's all about retention. It's all about expansion. That's what investors look for. And if that's how you define success, I worry that that is not going to be a successful model for an open source company in the next 10 years. And it's going to cause people heartache and heartburn. So my question to you as a community, as an owner of a company or a maintainer, what does your criteria of success look like? Because that dictates everything else when you talk about building an open source business and where these businesses are going to go in the future. And let me propose this to you. Why did you all on this session, watching in person or, after the fact, why did you get involved in open source? Was it to become rich? Because you believed in it? You loved it? You wanted to contribute? Like, what was your drive? Maybe it was to get a better job. I don't know. But why did you get involved in open source? If you're a maintainer, why did you start the project? All of those things are relevant. And many people, and if you look at a lot of companies nowadays, they're open sourcing not because of the movement or to help the community or to help the world. They're doing it as an exit strategy. They're doing it to increase shareholder value. Remember, I said earlier that the adoption of open source, how people perceive open source is, from an outside perspective, from a financial perspective, is adoption, adoption, adoption. Look at those adoption numbers. Look at those download numbers. Look at those users. How do I monetize that? That's where companies see open source's value. It's not in the value of the community, right? And they mistake it for a business model, right? And they think It's a freemium strategy, right? And here's a couple. These are a bit old, but these are from some venture capital people who are like, no, it's not an open source. It's not a business model, but it's a marketing gimmick, or it's for adoption. It's to get this really wide audience of people to use it, and then do things to get people to come back in and stick around, right? Like, if you start to use something and then you can't not use it, or you're stuck using it, that could be a good thing for investors, right? And so, you'll see that kind of mentality, that this is not a community effort. This is not something that we want to embrace the community, work with the community. We want to build something better to make the world a better place. No, no, no. This is about, how do we drive adoption? How do we make this a freemium strategy? And open source as a freemium strategy, open source as, a way to drive adoption, to potentially lock you in, it just doesn't seem right. But that's where we're at now from an open source perspective. And that's what we're teaching people in colleges. We're teaching people at universities. We're teaching people who are developers now. If you want to make a successful open source company, think shareholder value, and use open source as a freemium strategy to drive people to your as a service, to drive people to these other locations. And part of that adoption, right? Just wide scale adoption isn't enough. Many of you may have your own open source projects. You might be maintaining them, who are watching this video right now. And you might be saying, I've got 20 million people who use my thing. I've got 100 million downloads. But investors aren't interested. I can't make any money. Not profitable. And investors and executives are looking for stickiness. I will guarantee you, every open source company that I have talked to has a conversation at some point in their executive team about stickiness, which, there's a fine line between stickiness and lock-in. And oftentimes lock-in is viewed as a wonderful thing. It is a wonderful outcome. This is a quote from an article, Wall Street Analyst. I've used this for a couple of years now, so it's a little old, but he loves MongoDB because, moving your infrastructure, your data off of a database is incredibly risky and hard. And, if you raise prices, you do different things, people are going to stay because, you're not going to risk it. So once you get in, once you adopt, you can't get out. Hotel California, anybody? Just like Oracle in the 90s. I don't know. I grew up in the 90s, right? I started my career in the 90s in Oracle DBA, and I would not use them as Oracle as an example of a good community player or someone that I would aspire to be in the 90s, right? But hey, to each his own. But those changes, okay, that lock-in is why we've gone through this open source licensing whack-a-mole. And it's really like quite crazy, because when we talk about like open core, right? So let's go back to that open core model that I mentioned. People start off with GPL, right? That's classic model. So if you're going to make changes, you've got to publish them. But then the cloud comes along. Okay, let's do AGPL. Oh, you know what? Database as a service. All right, SSPL. So you start to move over and over again to try and like close off the ways people can potentially run something without you, or that you have competition. It's a very anti-open source way, right? So if somebody can do something better than you, then competition's healthy. And the argument against is always, well, we're investing all of this money. Again, it gets back to that freemium model, and that's what a lot of companies look at this as that freemium model. And this has caused a lot of those changes. And you know what? Users hate it, right? So if you go back to last year's talk, I gave a similar talk. There's a big section specifically on Elastic. So if you're interested in the Elastic licensing changes, I would encourage you to go watch last year's version of this. But what we saw was overnight a big FU to the community by changing licensing. There were 2,600-ish contributors to Elastic from an open source perspective who, we just changed your license. Big deal. Deal with it. Even after getting guarantees that they wouldn't. And that type of change happens often, but it's that whack-a-mole syndrome, right? So it's like somebody, I'm not making enough money. I'm not profitable. It's got to be someone else's fault. Let's prevent these other people from doing what they're doing. Because if this cloud provider is doing it, then they're stealing my business. I should be able to do that. And that mentality of, what's mine is mine and not yours. And you can't have any of my pie or I'm going to go home. And that SSPL type of trend or that kind of anti-cloud license is just another Band-Aid on top of, hey, we don't want competition. We want you to use us, right? We want you to use our stuff. We want you to use all the other open source components, all the other Lego blocks you want, as long as your foundation is built on us. Well, you can use whatever else you want. It's cool. But we don't want you to compete with us. We don't want you to have the ability to take stuff that we've been working on and make it better unless we benefit alone. And so it's a real gate towards innovation. But that being said, I believe that the SSPL is already outdated. I believe that it's kind of a dead on arrival type thing. Now, it'll exist for a few years and, we'll still hear quite a bit about it. But honestly, everything that I'm seeing right now is don't really care about, on-prem. We're all in on as a service. I know companies who have, use whatever, here's an SSPL license. Here's some special license that we've got for our software. Maybe there's an open source version. Maybe there isn't. Who cares? I care, but they don't. So, hey, take it, do it, whatever you want to do with it. But really, if you want to do anything positive with it, you got to run it in the cloud. And you got to run it on my service. And you're starting to see more and more of the vendors now just not release certain features, certain code, certain tools open source. It's just as a service. So it's not open source anymore. There might be some sort of like really narrow open source version that, is designed to get you into adopt, but it's really designed to push you into the cloud to do anything that's super useful. And so the current investment wisdom is as a service, as a service, as a service, as a service, as a service. That's way better than SSPL. So they want adoption in SSPL. And you could thank Snowflake a little bit for that in the database space because they had, kind of turned some heads there. But, you're going to see that continue as well. Now, all that being said, users have a very different take on all this, right? And so what do users want? And we're not talking about investors. Now, it's possible that, some of these can overlap, but largely open source for shareholders is very different than open source for the community and for the broader user group. They're not always the same. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they overlap, and that's where there's good things as well. I think I blew past that. Yeah. So open source has consistently been about, at least in users' mind, my mind, community, collaboration, freedom, innovation, equality, right? So this is about helping the greater good. And, hey, yeah, if we can make businesses out of it, that's awesome. We want to help and we want to be able to pay people to help do it. And that's cool. And we've seen so much innovation from the open source space. It's not crazy. There would be no internet as we know it today without those foundational pieces like Apache or Perl or PHP or Python, or fill in your favorite thing that I didn't mention because I don't want to upset anybody. All of these innovations, all of these new pieces of software have led to this innovation. And you see that from a user perspective, the things that users want, often are aligned with that. They want to move fast, right? They want to get adoption in the community, but because that will make the product better, it'll make it more production ready, right? And the more people who use it, the more the community is going to be able to support it and to grow it and to make it do cool things. They want their bugs fixed quickly through it. They want to make sure their data is secure. They want to connect all of these dots. Super important for them as that ecosystem grows. So their expectation is, from a project perspective, to get a lot of the same things that the company's trying to provide as a very narrow company. When you're talking about, a business running an open source company, right? It's, we want more adoption, obviously from a business perspective, but they want it because that's going to lead to more dollars. And more dollars, well, hey, that could eventually lead towards more investment in features. Sure, why not? Whereas from an open source perspective, we're looking at, we want more adoption because then more people will contribute, and then we'll get more features and we'll have more diversity that way. So it's similar outcomes, but different because one company controls the whole path, whereas the ecosystem or the community controls it. Now, unfortunately, when we're talking about many of these community-led or driven projects, maintainers just don't make enough to make this their full-time work. Or if they do, it's very small teams. Most projects out there, most things on GitHub do not have a big company behind them. And that's an important distinction, because this is where we're seeing a lot of, what we would classically consider that open source collaboration movement happen on projects that might not have the big company behind them anymore. And they might be, still where a lot of innovation is taking place, but all of the press, all of the focus is on these big companies that I mentioned that have gone IPO, that have been, quote unquote successful. And this is where people starting open source projects, if they're getting in it to build a business or to build something that could turn into a business, they're trying to emulate these companies. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, there are companies and efforts and a lot of work to try and fix this gap. But this gap is real. How do people pay or contribute to open source maintainers? It's not just about revenue. It's not just about giving money. Oftentimes it's about help. It's about, contributing. And unfortunately, right now, a lot of people treat open source as a buffet. What I mean by that is they take what is good. If they don't like it, they throw it out. And maybe they pay at the end. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's one of those free buffets in Vegas. But it's about picking and choosing and then changing it up every plateful. And the majority of people using open source take, fork, use, leech, discard. They don't contribute. And because of that, a lot of the contributions end up coming from these big companies. And they end up having to bear the bulk of this, and then they can claim the argument, like, we put all these investment dollars into this project. So it is a bit of a circular logic. And keep in mind that, if we go back to that Lego piece example or the buffet analogy, it's about those pieces moving in and out. And as you do that, though, you often lose sight of some of the components. And that leads to things like the log4j. Log4j happens just like shit happens. Log4j happens. And this leaves a bad taste in everybody's mouth because it's like, oh my God, open source. How could we like let this crazy community out there maintain this software? How could we let them leave this vulnerable? And it's not about that, I mean, proprietary software has problems as well, has security issues. But how many people are paid to work on Log4j? How many people, work on the company behind Log4j? How many people are working on the project? How many people are reviewing it? What's their incentive? How many people contributed back? How many people use it versus contribute back? It's probably a really low percentage. And, this gives open source a black eye from a community perspective. And then you have Sabotage. And I'm not talking about the epic Beastie Boys song, Sabotage. But if you do have that song, you can start playing it now because it can be like the soundtrack for the next slide, which is if you didn't see the maintainer of Colors and Faker had nuked his own project that was relied on by people. You see that this caused even more bad press and more people to say like, oh, open source. Can we really trust that community? Maybe we need a company or someone who we can hold accountable. And this is a very scary situation because so many people's things broke. And that leads to people starting to jump into, oh, well, we need to fix that issue. So what would fix that issue? Says no one. Government regulation. Yeah, we need the governments to step in. And this isn't just the U.S. government. A lot of U.S. government stuff here, but I've seen the Chinese government, get involved in things like, Alibaba around Log4j. I've also seen, the UK government, other governments in Europe. There's a big list of people who view open source as, well, maybe we should start to regulate it. Maybe we should have the American version of Log4j, and then we'll have the UK version and the Chinese version, and then we can all compete. So just what we need, more forks, right? And take that out of the hands of the community and make it so it's more, regulated. That just seems wrong. But we're starting to see some calls for that. And, all of this kind of ties into, we're right now swimming in kind of dangerous waters from an open source community perspective, right? We are really seeing that there are tons of warning signs here, right? Open source is being hijacked for business reasons. You can see that, that the downloaded open source software going to GitHub, it's often viewed as the freemium model as a service now. It's not just where people, start or do other things. Contributors are being treated very poorly. And, how long will they want to contribute if they're not, being able to maintain that code? How long are they going to freely give? The next generation of developers are starting to think that the way that these open source companies that went IPO, that is the right model. And freemium is open source. Open source isn't about community and giving away things. It's about, making it so people can get locked in. And, hey, governments, oversight coming. And the expectation for all of this is really high. And if it's not met, that's going to hurt all of our reputations. You're just those open source guys. Didn't work out. What can we do about it, though? And I mean, there are some things, and these are important things, right? We need to figure out how we can support the maintainers and those who own projects. Make sure that they understand that we have their backs. Contribute back to the community. Don't just take. If you are a user of one of these projects, or if you're a user of a project that doesn't have backing, contribute, even if it's just an article, even if it's, just a bug, report, something. Do it. We also need to start thinking about business models that don't just equate success to the revenue, right? How do we ensure that we can put the ecosystem growth over massive profits or shareholder value? How can we build a model that treats maintainers, contributors, and users, as well as shareholders or investors are treated in current commercial open source offerings? We need more community-minded individuals in leadership roles. If you look across the industry, most of these open source companies that are out in the public space, the pedigree isn't from an open source perspective. It's from companies that have long clashed with open source. How do we make this different? And I think this really boils down to the Cherokee proverb, right? Which wolf will you feed? And as we go forward, as we look at this ecosystem, are we going to start to follow the ways that we've seen these publicly traded companies, these investor-led open source companies, develop open source and take it? Are we going to go down that freemium model? Or are we going to look more towards the community? Are we going to look towards how we can grow the ecosystem, how we can collaborate and make things better? Thank you for attending. And if there are more questions, feel free to ask. I appreciate you hanging out with me.